Hello, everyone. We will be starting our Q3 briefing session in a few moments. While we give the audience a chance to tune in, let me share a few operational notes. We hope to make this an interactive session today, so feel free to send in questions using the chat function throughout the presentation. They may be answered immediately or brought up later during Q&A, but we will try to get to them all. Please note that this program will be recorded. And finally, as always, I want to thank our anchor signers, Arbella Insurance Group, Mass General Brigham, Mass Mutual, Putnam Investments, State Street, Red Hat Software, and Vertex for their continued generous support, which allows us to bring you programs like the one today. So let us begin. Welcome, Compact Signers, to our Q3 briefing session for 2023. I am Kim Borman, Executive Director of the Boston Women's Workforce Council. All of us gathered here today endorse closing gender and racial wage gaps at our workplaces. As 100% talent Compact Signers, you are the heroes of Greater Boston because you've committed to changing policies and practices that leave marginalized groups behind in regard to promotions and higher salaries. You are, however, a unique and select group. Most employers do not pay the attention you do to pay equity, compelling many states to pass a range of pay transparency laws. Today, we will discuss some of these current and potential pieces of legislation to make sure you are adequately prepared for what is coming down the road. We have two experts here on the subject that I'm thrilled to introduce. The first is Garry Straker, Vice President of Compensation Consulting at Salary.com, one of our more recent Compact Signers. Garry has more than 25 years of experience helping clients all over the country from a variety of industries leverage technology, data, and labor market insights to design market-aligned total compensation packages. He is keenly aware of the pay transparency legislation that has been passed in states like California, New York, and Illinois. He will provide the national perspective in today's discussion. In addition to Garry, we will hear from the Boston Women's Workforce Council own co-chair, Evelyn Murphy. Ev is a PhD economist who has studied and advocated for pay equity throughout her career. She authored the book published by Simon & Schuster, Getting Even, Why Women Don't Get Paid Like Men and What to Do About It, and founded The Wage Project, a nationwide grassroots group dedicated to closing gender wage gaps. As most of you know, she was also the first woman in Massachusetts to hold a statewide constitutional office as lieutenant governor. Ev is behind pay transparency legislation before Beacon Hill right now. Facilitating the conversation today will be Tizana Dearing, the host of Radio Boston on WBUR. She's been with the radio station for over a decade. Prior to joining the Radio Boston team, Tizana was a professor at Boston College, where she taught social innovation and leadership, two things that are very important to closing gender and racial wage gaps. And with that, let us get started.
Well, thank you very much, Kimberly, for that introduction. And it's a real privilege to be here, and I'm really excited to be here, knowing that my organization has become one of the most recent signers of the 100% Talent Compact. So really interested in this conversation around pay transparency. This is an area where we have been spending a lot of time working with our clients in different parts of the country. And of course, over the last couple of years, we have seen some significant legislative activity as it relates to new laws or amendments to existing laws, particularly focused on pay transparency. And, you know, if you look at the list of states that have already passed, Illinois and Hawaii were the most recent laws passed that occurred this summer. Others have had some laws in place for a couple of years now, notably Colorado, I think, was the first. But generally speaking, the pay transparency legislation that we're seeing comes in really two flavors. One is states that require proactive wage range disclosure. And what this means is that it's requiring employers in those states to actually provide wage ranges in externally facing job postings. And you're going to see, of course, New York City was a municipality that introduced that requirement, and New York State has since followed. So now it applies to all employers in New York State. But what we've seen is an increase in organizations that have been willing and aspire to actually share wage ranges in their job postings, even in those states where it's not necessarily required. But so we're seeing just certainly an uptick in the number of organizations, regardless of the legislation, being proactive about providing wage range disclosures. There are other states, like the one I'm reside in, for instance, Connecticut, that haven't gone quite as far. And they're requiring wage range disclosures or information upon request to either job applicants or candidates or employees when they request that information. So this is actually, sorry, there's some background noise there. Someone can mute their microphone. But so this is an interesting trend that we're seeing. We are expecting this trend to continue. I think we're going to see other states, and certainly there's a lot of legislative activity, and it's hard to keep track of all 50 states. But we know that there are bills in circulation that may be pending, and we may see other states introduce this type of requirement. Interestingly enough, the European Union has also jumped on this bandwagon. So they passed this summer a directive requiring equal pay and transparency throughout all 28 member states. So a lot of activity going on there. And if we could just move to the next slide. So another interesting development is career progression disclosures. Colorado announced this summer an amendment that requires employers announce, post, or otherwise make known all opportunities for promotion. And this is an interesting development because it goes one step further and really tries to address gender and or racial pay gaps by providing equal access to opportunities for upward advancement in organizations. Of course, that lack of demographic diverse representation across certainly higher pay tiers in organizations is one of the root causes and fundamental problems associated with the persistent racial and or gender pay gaps that exist, across our country. And, I think what we're seeing is organizations are paying attention to this legislation. It remains to be seen if other states are going to adopt career progression disclosures. The European Union, it should be noted, actually introduced in their directive a requirement for more disclosure around career progression opportunities. And certainly for any employers in the United States who have operation in Europe, they're going to have to pay attention to that. That provision is going to be rolled out over 3 years. But nevertheless, we are seeing, anecdotally, I can share, a lot more attention and focused on being more transparent about developing robust job architecture, about defining and clarifying roles within organizations in a way which allows employees to understand and distinguish between job levels within an organization, and also gain a better understanding of what they must do in order to develop their own qualifications, skills, and competencies to advance to those higher level positions. So I thought that this was a very interesting development. Again, it remains to be seen if this is going to be a trend that we see in terms of legislation that is passed. But anecdotally, I can share with you that many employers are already trying to spend more time in providing greater transparency around not just wage growth potential within their organization, but career growth potential. We can just move to the next slide. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but the career progression disclosure, interesting to note that the penalties are significant for non-disclosure here. And I don't have any insight into what the enforcement activity or action is going to be by regulatory agencies on this, but certainly, organizations are going to have to pay attention and be compliant even with this new requirement. And so I think that this is something that, as we talk and think about pay transparency, we should certainly be aware of, obviously, the pay transparency requirements, but also give some consideration or thought to career progression opportunities and providing equal access to opportunities in the workplace. And that's what these new career progression disclosures are all about. Let me just spend a couple minutes on, what we're seeing in the marketplace in terms of, the upside and the potential downside of pay transparency, because there was a time, and I've been doing this for, as Kimberly mentioned, 25 years now. There was a time, and Evelyn's smiling because she knows this, there was a time when employers used to explicitly state that employees could not talk about pay. And I remember the days when that used to be stated in employee handbooks. Well, thank goodness we've moved away from that. But pay transparency does come with some challenges, and organizations do need to be prepared. We know, for instance, on the positive side, is that it is helping and having impact on reducing gender and racial pay gaps. It also has a positive impact in terms of employee trust. And certainly that's been proven in lots of different studies, including our own research here at salary.com. We also know that job postings that do actually have wage disclosures within them actually result in potentially more job applicants, and the likelihood that job seekers will more likely apply for a position where their wage disclosure is actually provided. So those are all good things. On the downside, it certainly requires more communication and training around explaining pay practices and pay differences to employees and certainly first line managers. And we're spending a lot of time working with organizations to help them ensure that first line managers and supervisors are able to have a confident, clear discussion about pay practices and policies. I always like to say to clients, how much you pay is important, but your employees want to know how you pay. What are the underlying principles? What are the guardrails? What is your overall compensation philosophy? And that does require some time. It does require some training, and certainly organizations are having to invest in that. Certainly understanding and monitoring how you pay people to make sure that pay disparities are not either created either inadvertently or explicitly. And so organizations are having to spend a lot more time doing things like pay equity analysis and studies. And one of the results of increased pay transparency, and this has been supported by studies, particularly some that have come out in Europe where this requirement has existed longer, is that pay transparency has had the impact of resulting in more compressed wages in some places. And so the concern that a lot of organizations have is that when you have pay transparency, having outliers or having people who are paid significantly different than their peers is a potential area of concern or exposure. And organizations are obviously they don't want to create that potential liability or misperception. And so it has had a tendency to sort of compress wages. What we're seeing is that organizations are still want to reward high performers in terms of linking pay to performance, but organizations are also having to spend a lot more time making sure that their performance management practices and the performance evaluation processes are robust, credible, and consistent so that you can justify those pay differences for job-related factors. Anyway, that's just a little bit of background on what we're seeing, nationally and to a certain extent internationally. Evelyn, happy to pass it over to you. Let's talk about Massachusetts.
Thanks, Garry. I must say that's a really impressive presentation and wise in what has been happening. What I want to do is add a little bit of perspective before I get down into Massachusetts, because when you listen to what Garry has just said, you have to wonder why all this state activity. And there are, in my mind, two drivers of all this activity. One is that there hasn't been any significant federal legislation affecting pay practices, particularly around the wage gaps, since 1964, when President Kennedy signed that bill. And that was really a bill about pay equity, equal pay for equal or comparable work. So since 1964, we've learned a lot about what the wage gap is all about, and only part of it has to do with this equal pay for equal work. The Paycheck Fairness Act started to be filed in 1998 and is still not passed, so that keeps moving along in Congress. The Lilly Ledbetter bill, much touted, really was only about giving women more time for litigation, but had nothing to do really with the wage gap. So what you're seeing now with all this state action and some local municipal action is really because this is not being solved at the federal level and unified. So we're going to get lots of different things. The other thing I would point out to you, and you have to listen carefully, is that the wage gap that we're talking about, the thing that gets reported every single month by the Labor Department, is not equal pay for equal work. And it is about averages. It's about adding up under your roof all men's earnings and comparing the average of men's earnings with the average of women's earnings, the average of white earnings compared to the average of people of color's earnings under your roof. Those are the wage gaps. They're averages or mediums, but that's different than the equal pay for equal work. And it requires, therefore, some changes in how we go about this, because what we've seen over these 60 years is that the wage gap itself doesn't go away, even when we've gotten far more precise and followed up on the pay and the equal pay for equal or comparable work. So we got two things going on at once. And what Garry has just described has a lot to do with both of those things. And that's new. So what you're seeing is on the wage gap side of things, what's affecting the promotion up of women, of people of color, in order to deal with the wage gap, is a whole recent phenomenon. So let me put you in the context of Massachusetts and settle this into what we're doing here. In Massachusetts, we passed legislation in 2016, I believe, called the Equal Pay Act, which was really still focused on equal pay for equal or comparable work. And it also added a little bit in terms of going one step further and talking about banning the discussion or asking in an interview what your salary history was. And so what happened with that was that the replacement of the question of what's your salary history got replaced with what are your salary expectations. And so we all know men will have enormous salary expectations, and women, people of color, tend to be more modest in our requests or expectations in order to get in the door or to be successful. So that didn't solve the problem. The Massachusetts legislation we have now is both on dealing with cleaning up the pay equity legislation that we just passed a couple of years ago, and also in a very interesting way, adding to this promotion advancement part of the wage gap solution. Now, the bill that is about to be reported out of committee responds to those 2 points in several ways. It requires, first of all, that employers provide the salary range for any job posting. And it requires that for employers with 25 employees or more. We initially started with 100 because that's the other part of the bill on reporting salary earnings or placement of where employees are in the EEO-1 format. But it also, when you report these salary ranges, clearly it needs to cover more than just 100 employees. So we moved it down to 25. That has been accepted by the business community as well. There's some grumbling, but it's reasonable. It's not as tight or as rigorous as some other states, but it's where recent trends have been for 25 employees. We also get into a part of the bill which talks about if an employer wants some information about the salary range for the job title that she or he has, that employer has to provide that salary range. And it allows an employee, as Garry was just saying, to see what they might do to earn more, even in the job they're in, because what qualifications, what other experience, whatever else might help them. But it's important information. And it's not, from what I could listen to in Garry, it's not included in those other bills. And it doesn't deal with moving up, but it does deal with the wage gap itself by moving you up within your job title. The final part of our bill has to do with reporting every year the EEO-1 filings that private and nonprofit employers file with the Labor Department, and the EEO-4 that municipalities also report in, so that we begin to see, and the Secretary of Labor and Workforce Development will then report out annually what the representation is. The EEO-1 format is basically going from executives down to laborers. It has job categories, job classifications, and you report in the numbers of men, women, people of color in these various categories. It's very similar. It is the format that we use with the Women's Workforce Council. So it's no additional filing, but it allows us to look at sectors. The Secretary will then report out annually for the healthcare sector, for the education sector, for the construction sector, for the architectural sector. We'll report out annually the gender and racial representations in those sectors. That allows an employer to look and say, okay, where am I in that? Am I competitive? Do I have the representation that we need? Or do I need to be more intentional about advancing people, women, people of color? And so, but it also allows employees to look at the representational presence in their industry and decide whether they feel their company is leading or not, or understand in the sector what kind of hurdles they're facing. It is the beginning. It is not a big step. It is a very modest step. But what it does, unlike those other states, is that this is data driven. We want to make sure that we start out understanding what these gaps are and whether we're making progress on them. And we can't do that just by best efforts or by litigating against those who haven't posted all this information. We need the data to do that. So this data demand is original. The only other state in the country that gathers information from the EEO-1 filing is California, and California does not make that data public. It only uses it for its own litigation against bad actors. Our bill is not a blame and shame bill. What we have right now is a coalition of advocates, working people, labor unions, people of color, all the racial and gender advocates, and AIM, the most conservative of the statewide business organizations and the largest business organization, came and testified in favor of this legislation. And behind that, we're now working and having support from the other major business groups. But it shows what you do when you can find a thoughtful approach and provide this critical information. And we also have the Bass Municipal Association on the public side doing that. So that's where we are. We believe right now that, and let me make two final points. One is the obvious, which is there need to be some hopes and a better sense of moving women, people of color up the roles, leadership in particular, but advancing. But also in Massachusetts right now, one of the most important things we have for our own economic interests is that the workers here want to stay here and work here and not leave. The Mass Taxpayers Foundation, when they issued that report about who's leaving Massachusetts, it's not the old folks that are taking our money and going down to Florida to protect it. The big bar on that chart was workers from 25 to 35 years old. We need to show workers in the prime of their working years, we need to show them that Massachusetts has an economy that is fair and offers upward paths to everybody. so that we not only keep our important workers here, but attract others from other states that also say this is a state of opportunity economically, and they're living it. So that's the pitch for today on that bill. I am hopeful and optimistic that we can get some action on it.
So I think this is the part where Garry and I now also turn our cameras and microphones back on. And it's great to join the two of you. I'm here in studio too. I figured I'll just stay right here where we do Radio Boston. It seems like a good place to have this conversation. There are a couple of sort of questions that I want to start with right out of the gate, and we'll go from there. And Evelyn, you said this sentence, so I am going to say it back to you because I want to underscore it. The bill is about to be reported out of committee. That's a thing. And it's a new thing. And so I just want to make sure you said that out loud. And I'd like you to tell our audience who may not understand what that means, although I bet they all do. I want to give you a chance to articulate what that means, because you did say it out loud.
I did say it out loud. Tizana, you're right. You've called me on it. There are rumors, or we've had text messages within the last hour, that this bill might be reported out today as we meet. I have not got that confirmed yet, but what it says to me is all of this work beforehand to get all the reservations and the and the opposition, that we are close. And what's important about it, Tizana, is that if we can get it out soon, hopefully today, that we will have the time to get movement through the legislature before the end of the year. And that becomes important. If anybody who passes bills would understand, because next year there will be 6,000 odd bills in a huge pile that all have to be dealt with between then and the end of the session in the summer. So you want to be in front of the curve. And the excitement is, if we can get this bill out, and it's still an if, I've got to hedge my bets on this, but if we can get it out soon, wonderfully today, then we have a real shot at getting this bill passed this year.
And I'll say two things here, not to pour any cold water on that at all, but to underscore the ifs that you're saying for people in our 118 participants who may not know this context. This has been, we have what is often known as a slow-moving legislature. We were one of the last 5 states in the country to finalize the budget for this year. I just had Governor Maura Healey on Radio Boston yesterday. One of the open issues remaining, I mean, the legislature in that budget allocated for a tax package, and yet we may or may not actually get details of that tax package passed, and that money's already allocated. So these ifs that you're laying out, Evelyn Murphy, are not you being demure. These are real ifs.
Oh boy, are they ever, Tizana. and real ifs with those more important bills still pending and pushing there. So, but this is not waxing political stuff for you. I do think that a bill like this, passing this year, it's not as divisive, given what we've put together and the support for it. It's not divisive, and therefore it can be. It has a spirit to it that I think may make it of interest between now and the end of the year, as showing some accomplishment and some forward progress behind all the stuff, the hard negotiations that are going on that you're citing.
So Garry, Straker, I wanted to do those couple of questions with Evelyn so that now when I turn to you with the couple follows, we've got that context. Evelyn laid out what is in that, that legislation. Thinking back to the slides that you put up about other states, states like Hawaii or California or Connecticut, Nevada, and of course, Evelyn compared what's on the table here in Massachusetts, for example, to California explicitly. Initially, first, your reactions to what's on the table here and where it fits in that landscape of other recent legislation that's been passed in other states.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to hear that this bill is going to be coming out of committee in Massachusetts. And, I think it's consistent with some of the other states that we're seeing, particularly perhaps Colorado and California, for instance, who probably have gone maybe further than others. Evelyn mentioned the EU1 pay data reporting, or the EU1 demographic reporting. And maybe just a point of clarification, Evelyn, did that include pay data reporting by job classification?
No, because it's not collected right now. But,
Okay.
But the language is such that it could be included if it's in the component number 1.
Understood. But so much of what this bill is addressing is sort of the underlying fundamental root causes of persistent gender and/or racial pay gaps. It's it's a lack of representation, as I talked about earlier, but it's also a lack of pay information. And let's face it, the employees nowadays have more rights than they probably have ever had, and certainly at the federal level, employees are free to talk about wages amongst themselves, and that's a protected right. But as we so often see, is that in organizations there can be misperceptions or distortions about pay practices or policies that are not grounded in reality. And I think one of the things that this bill does in terms of providing explicit pay transparency is allowing employers to manage or control the narrative and provide information that is accurate and consistently communicated across an organization. And I think that's a significant and very positive development.
So Garry, here's my second question to you. And what made me think of it was Evelyn pointing out the unintended consequences of the design of the 2016 Equal Pay Act in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question to you is, to be clear, in the states that you presented, and the legislation that has been passed and what's
Mm-hmm.
happening there, basically, is it working?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. Fundamentally, is it working? Well, we do know, and studies have supported this. There've been some academic studies, again, some here in the U.S., some in Europe, where pay transparency is helping reduce gender and/or racial pay gaps. Has it solved the problem unequivocally? No, it's very much a work in progress. But I will also say this, Tizana, regardless of the legislation that it's occurring in, maybe a dozen or so states, however many we have nowadays, employers are beginning to shift how they administer compensation, in part as a result of this legislative trend that we're seeing, but employee expectations have changed pretty dramatically. And one of the things we've seen in the last couple of years, during a period when the labor market has been very tight, and there's been, very well publicized, documented shortage of workers, organizations are having to find new approaches to recruit and retain their existing employees. And part of it is making sure that their pay practices and policies align with the values of those they're seeking to employ. And I think expectations amongst employees has changed so significantly that I think you ignore that at your peril. Well, people want to work for organizations whose values align with their own. And I think more and more in the workforce today, expectations have changed so dramatically that you have to respond to that.
So that's helpful, because what it allows us to do now, so we've been very focused right so far in our conversation, both on states and legislation they've passed. And of course, Evelyn reminded us why this has been happening at a state by state level rather than at a federal level. I mean, 1964 was almost 60 years ago now. But we've been talking about state level legislation and the Massachusetts level legislation, and it's stayed us for the last few minutes. I want to step back now and sort of widen our aperture a little bit. And Garry, you've given us a way to do that. I'll start actually though with you, Evelyn. If employers are changing their behavior based on employee expectations, this is an age-old question. Do you legislate this, or do you allow the market or encourage the market, or does the market take charge with voluntary steps? And there are always people who say, let the companies do it themselves, and people who say, oh, hell no. I wonder where you think we are in that mix now, Evelyn.
I think we're in the middle ground of that mix, which is to say, we're not going to be radical. Tizana, the last time I filed this bill in the last session, we had individual employers reporting their EEO-1 data, and it would all be published by employer. And that got tanked or held in the Senate Ways and Means Committee and never saw the light of day after it got reported out of committee, because it was a blame and shame bill, or it had the potential to do that. So I went to AIM and I said, help me write a bill
And
that
being associated industries. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Help me write a bill that we can all agree to. And I have to tell you, I think this is a better bill. And the reason I think it's a better bill is because it lays down the groundwork. It's not solving the whole thing at once, but at least it's giving us the basis of information about these sectors. And it's getting people comfortable with sharing this information, reporting it at the state level. And it's also giving employees the ability to look at that data as well as the employers to see where they are. So to me, it's that step. It's a small step forward, but it's foundational for what can happen in the future. And I'm not one who at this stage believes that you can solve it in one piece of legislation. I've seen too many flaws in the legislation all along. But I do think that what has happened recently, and now recently, I mean, in the last 5-6 years, is that employers are finally beginning to see that this wage gap is not solved by equal pay for equal work, and beginning to understand that we need to make some progress, and that employees now, this younger generation, is demanding far more transparency. So that trend that Gary's talking about is, I think, terrific, and helping everybody to get comfortable with more transparency. That's a long answer, Tizana, but I do see us as in the middle of this and foundational.
And I will underscore, actually, I moderated an economic outlook conversation of which AIM was a host and a part last week.
Mhm.
They expressed great anxiety over this outflux of workers aged 25 to 35, and
Mhm.
underscored the importance of the next round of equal pay legislation and practices as key to that. So Garry, I want to come back to the national now for a minute.
Yeah.
With all of this landscape around us, one of the things that's been on my mind is the extent to which the Supreme Court rulings, especially around affirmative action, the Supreme Court ruling has led to a movement, is my word, but a movement across the country to push back on many things that are seen as related to, touching to, abutting. You pick the word,
Sure.
around diversity, equity, inclusion, equality, moves in the private sector and in industry towards equity, that somehow are getting swept up alongside the affirmative action ruling around college admissions. And I am intrigued, at least in watching that, and curious how you see that affecting or impacting what we're talking about here today.
Yeah, Tizana, boy, isn't that just a can of worms? That whole ruling and the impact it's having on the workplace. And of course, we're seeing in different parts of the country a lot of pushback, even amongst legislators, on employers' ability to introduce things like diversity, equity, inclusion training. And so, again, I come back to, there was this diversity, equity, inclusion has been a strategic priority for, virtually every employer in this country, really coming out of the pandemic. We had the Me Too movement, the George Floyd incident. So we had, the pendulum swang, pretty aggressively in the direction of making sure that workplaces were being more inclusive and welcoming to a diverse demographic. And we've always maintained when we work with clients that, your commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, which let's face it, that tends to be a work in progress in virtually every organization. I haven't heard a single organization said, yes, we fixed that problem, we've solved for that. And I think the pay gap and pay equity concerns are in a similar sort of position. Those two, I think, are very interrelated, by the way. I think it's hard to be credible and effective about your commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion if you haven't appropriately addressed the pay equity issue and pay gap concerns. Those two go hand in hand. I see them as two sides of the same coin. We are seeing a little bit, and I think coincidentally with that, Tizana, is that there's all of a sudden some uncertainty in the economy. And in some sectors, we are seeing some softening, right, of the labor market, and but it's a little bit uneven. We just came out of a period where the labor market was extremely tight. It was hard to find workers. And so organizations were all in trying to differentiate themselves and introduce their hiring practices, making sure that they had an inclusive work environment, making sure their pay practices and their pay policies aligned with their cultural values. A softening labor market, I think, is probably going to cause a lot of organizations to maybe pump the brakes a little bit. And I don't know, again, that's probably going to be a little bit uneven. There are some organizations who are going to continue to be all in on diversity, equity, inclusion and addressing gender or racial pay gaps. We know that a lot of organizations out there are voluntarily disclosing, for instance, their pay gap on external facing web pages. So I think it's going to be interesting to see. My own gut thought is that I think employers, the vast majority of employers, want to do the right thing, and they need to do the right thing because, again, employee expectations have changed. So I think that we're going to see organizations continue to be active in those areas, although they may have to sort of pump the brakes a little bit and slow things down. And there certainly seems to be some indication of that, just as a result of the fact that we're seeing a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion officers and jobs being, redefined in a lot of organizations.
So I'm gonna sort of grab a pin and put it in the softening labor market point because I want to come back to it. There are a couple things that I want to talk about there. I'm only putting a pin in it because, Evelyn, we have a question that is more specific to the legislation that's on the table in Massachusetts. Okay. And so I want to get to that first, and then we're going to come back to this question of softening labor market, although I will note Massachusetts may be softening less. And I will note on top of that our unemployment rate for Black and Brown employees is not as low as our unemployment rate overall. One of the questions is whether the pay gap for those with disabilities is investigated or reported. And so, Evelyn, I wonder if there's consideration there in the legislation that's on the table here in the Commonwealth.
Whether it includes people with disabilities?
Yeah.
In the language? No, it does not. It was not deliberately left out. It just wasn't part of the usual thinking about this. But if let me think about it. It's a valid issue and an important one. Thank you.
Garry, then let me ask you, in the other states that you presented to us in that first slide, ranging from Washington to Nevada, New York, Maryland, disabilities considered explicitly in any of those laws?
Yeah, well, there are some states who have a pretty extensive protected class that are included under their equal pay legislation. So a lot of the laws and changes that I referred to earlier are amendments to existing equal pay laws. But if you look at a state like New Jersey, for instance, their list of protected classes in their state level equal pay legislation is extremely long. It includes, for instance, veterans, breastfeeding moms, and I'm pretty sure people with disabilities are included in that as well. So, but generally speaking, it's most of this in terms of pay equity legislation, it's focused primarily on gender and race. And so Outside of New Jersey, I just can't recall off the top of my head if other states have coverage for disabled employees as well.
So I'm going to take that pin back out of the softening labor market now. And this question I was thinking about this morning, I was, getting ready this morning and listening to Morning Edition, which if you work for WBUR, that's what you do in the mornings. And I was listening at the national level to a conversation with Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders about the United Auto Workers strike. And of course, one of the things that he was invoking was the pay gap between the chief executive at General Motors, who makes $21 million a year, and a starting auto worker who might make $17 an hour. It strikes me, Evelyn Murphy, that there are levels of cultural change that he is pointing to, that transparency may be insufficient, even good data may be insufficient to address. And I wonder about that. But also what it made me think of, and Evelyn, I'll start with you, but Garry, this is actually a question for both of you. I'm just going to start with Evelyn. It is notable that we are now in a situation where there are several major unions striking at the same time. So you've got SAG-AFTRA, and I'll note SAG-AFTRA carries the contract for the newsroom at WBUR, but not the same one as we see with actors, for example, striking. And so I am also curious where this increased union activity and striking that we're seeing fits in this landscape in your mind. So Evelyn, you first, and then I'll go over to you, Garry.
Oh God, you're tough.
Q&A part.
Oh, no, but they're extraordinary questions, Tizana. So
Thank you.
Here's my take on it, which is I've now been at this with this bill for 6 years. And right after this, we're having another meeting with our coalition and our executive committee coalition. And I'm out talking. So I have tunnel vision on this stuff. I see the same kind of strife and testing that's going on around the unions throughout the country. But I also know if I take my eye off of this and try and put it in a larger context like that, except for the economic development argument, which I think, again, is in the state's best interest, except for that, I will get distracted and not be able to move this bill. And the bill will not come to passage. So to me, the issue is I see and respect and agree with a lot of the other pressures right now to make the structure more equitable and fair, from the CEOs taking multi-million dollars down to the hardworking people. Those are my values too, but I can't get engaged in it in this bill and get the bill passed.
And is that a larger lesson about sort of the landscape of social action, Evelyn, and the different sort of players and pieces? When I taught in social work at Boston College, one of the things that we would talk about a lot is it is a landscape, and you will have activists in different places who may have to stay very focused in their zone across that larger landscape.
That's exactly what we're trying to do here. It is, I got to stay focused in our zone. The landscape of other organizations that are part of this coalition right now and supporting the bill gives me an ability to say to the legislature, here's the support for it. And it's broad, and it goes into the civil rights groups. It goes into lots beyond the Black and brown and women's groups. And so that's important at the small level. But in terms of the bigger picture and joining up with all kinds of other activities, you can never get your legislation passed if you get that diverted in your attention and your time.
Garry, how about over to you now?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I mean, we do know that union representation has dropped dramatically in this country from its heyday, and I forget the exact numbers, but we're down to, I think, 10 or 12% of the U.S. workforce is represented by a union. But they are making headlines. And I think there's really two issues as it relates to what's going on in the unions right now, who are having a moment. Is that one is the economic settlements that they're going to end up with. There's going to be, publicly disclosed. And so we're seeing numbers of, 30% being thrown out over a 4-year contract. That's a pretty significant wage increase over the period of 4 years. So I think other employees are going to be sort of looking at that and wondering whether or not they should, can expect the same from their employer. So there may be some upward pressure on wages as a result of expectations of employees, demanding or wanting more, like the unions may end up getting. So, but there's also an issue around, this whole question about representation and organizing. So we know that, there's been lots of organizing efforts in Starbucks, for instance, the Amazon warehouses. Some have been successful, some have not. But it does really call into question is, will it encourage employees to think that they're better off by being represented or not? And I think so much of the way employees think about that is whether or not they feel as though they're getting a fair shake. Are they being treated fairly and consistently across the organization? And certainly, I think pay transparency, disclosing pay practices and policies, and making sure that they are administered fairly and consistently can address employees' concerns, about being treated fairly and consistently in the workplace.
So this brings us back to, on your pros and cons list, your emphasis on trust between employees and employers by making the pay gaps transparent and then closing them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that the more employees feel that they can trust their employer in terms of being fair and making sure that they're addressing things like pay gaps and pay disparities, I think the less likely they are probably going to want to join a union. But it remains to be seen.
But it's trust and verify. That's the rule.
So one of the questions that came from our audience today has to do with employers getting their houses in order to be prepared for legislation that may be coming, or, at the federal level, Garry, maybe how employers prepared where legislation was coming. Evelyn, I'll come to you. Thoughts about, aware of what is in the bill that you have been working on for 6 years, or the multiple versions and the one you feel most comfortable with now. How do employers here in the Commonwealth start thinking about getting their houses in order for what may be yet to come?
Well, and that's important. It means writing into the bill when it gets passed a time in which, before it takes effect, employers can truly adapt or adopt to what the new plans are. So it really is about how do you create a time that's short enough to keep people's attention, but long enough to deal with the details and get the capacity you need internal to an employer, long enough to do that. And that's what we did with pay equity legislation the last time. It was a 2-year period of which lawyers were out training and talking extensively. We'll do that again because it's important. You want to make sure that by the time this bill takes effect, employers have fully anticipated and planned for it.
And Garry?
Yeah, I mean, I think having a window of opportunity to prepare is important. And, for instance, Hawaii just passed their new pay transparency law this summer. The effective date is January 1, 2024. Illinois, on the other hand, their effective date for new legislation around pay transparency is effective January 1, 2025. So big difference there in terms of the time to prepare. But what we're seeing is organizations typically have a lot of housekeeping to do to get comfortable with this notion of more pay transparency. It is still causing a lot of anxiety and sleepless nights amongst HR professionals and compensation professionals. And if that's the case, then you probably need to do some work around making sure that your data is up to date, that you have done things like salary compression analysis, pay equity analyses across your population to make sure that you don't have any significant outliers that are potential areas of concern. And one thing organizations have to get comfortable with is determining what they're actually going to disclose in external facing job postings as far as wage ranges. And, most of the other states are providing some latitude in that regard. And a lot of organizations, what we're seeing, although it does vary a little bit, are just providing a hiring range in external facing job postings. But when an employee asks for their wage range, you have to provide them the full range. So it's important to understand what you're going to be communicating externally and how that compares to how you're paying already your current incumbents.
Now, Evelyn, with all of the ifs and caveats in mind from the beginning of this conversation, I'm thinking about somebody who might be listening right now, who just heard the investments and the work that Garry said you need to do to get your house in order. And I'm thinking about somebody in our currently 101 participants who says, I have 26 employees right now. I heard Evelyn Murphy say, this bill, should it pass, covers employers of 25 employees or more. I operate on thin margins. I can't afford to do everything Garry Straker just said I need to do to get my house in order, to be responsive to, those requirements. What's your answer to that?
Well, my answer is what Garry was just talking about. I think is more on the larger employers. When you're down to 25 or 26 employees, and you're posting a job, it's not as complicated for you as it is for a State Street to be reporting. So I think and I think as we move into that consideration of how long it takes to adjust and anticipate, I would hope some small employers get involved with setting the parameters. There's no set answer to this, but I do think I wouldn't overcomplicate it for the smaller employers, because I don't think it's going to be that big of a challenge for them.
Does that sound right, Garry?
Yeah, I was going to agree with Evelyn on that. I mean, it's we don't want people to have sort of a deer in the headlights moment and panic about this. I think some of what the organization should do is basic blocking and tackling. It shouldn't be a heavy lift for a lot of smaller organizations. Yes, you're going to have to sort of pay attention and be a little bit more disciplined and structured about it, and evaluate how you're paying current employees and bringing in new hires. But that shouldn't be a heavy lift. And I will also say this: Massachusetts is one of the states, back when the original pay equity law was passed, the Attorney General did a terrific job in providing guidance and legislation around how to do a pay equity analysis for smaller employers, those less than 50. It's all out there on the Massachusetts DOL website. Again, not a heavy lift. You can do a lot of this work in a spreadsheet if you're a small organization.
Evelyn, you know this state well. And you've been a servant to the Commonwealth for a long time. You've given a huge percentage of your life the last 6 years to this. So as we're wrapping, why?
Oh, Tizana, because when I first got my first job after getting a PhD in economics, I was told that, don't worry, the guy who was hired with me was a GS9 and I was a GS7 or something like that. Maybe it was 11.9. And I went to the boss and I said, hey, why is Dave getting more money? And boss says back, don't worry, Evelyn, you girls will catch up. Girls at that time, you girls will catch up. It's only a matter of time till you get better educated, till you have more work experience and all that stuff. That was when the wage gap was women made 60 cents for a dollar. Having lived my life out now, and we're only at 80 cents, depending on whose data you want to believe, we haven't gotten there. So to me, this has been a personal measure of, I want to see a time in which men and women, people of color, we don't have these wage gaps anymore. And that, along with the social agenda from the civil rights movement, have been the two themes for all of my working career. I just want to keep advancing them. And I believe this coming, in the last couple of years, coming to the realization that businesses also see that they want to contribute, that it's up to them to play in this. It's not up to fixing women and people of color, get us more educated, working longer, but businesses have a responsibility here. That recognition has been a breakthrough. It's a step forward. And now if we don't take advantage of it, we'll be in the same inequitable place 20 or 30 years from now. So it's a moment of extraordinary opportunity.
And on that note, I'll hand it back to Kimberly Borman.
Here we go. Oh, I can't even tell you what a wonderful panel this has been. I'm going to answer one of the questions that Evan Garry answered in a different way, which is if you need help in any of the basics, start by doing the math, and please either contact us at the BWWC or look at wagegapcalculator.org. And that's where you start. You see what your numbers are, because you can't make changes until you know what the metrics are. Thank you again to the panel and to our audience. It's been fascinating. We hope we've given you some insight into what pay transparency laws could mean for your organization. In closing, I want to just give you all a pitch for our annual Effective Practices Conference, which is going to be on Wednesday, December 6th from 8:30 to 11:30 in person on the 17th floor of our new building, Boston University's Center for Computing and Data Sciences. We'll be releasing the results of our 2023 data collection, so it will be an exciting event. Thanks to everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you.